My name is Masih Sadat. I'm the Vice Chairman of NASIM. For those of you who doesn't know, NASIM is the network of academics, students, and other interested in the Middle East. And we're a mainly student-driven association. We do events like this. Just last year we had a conference just next on the other side of the bridge about Palestinian rights with Dr. Masih and Israeli-Palestinian experts and journalists. And this year we are very excited to have a guest as prominent as Professor Finkelstein. Please give a warm welcome to our moderator, Videography.
Yesterday evening, Professor Finkelstein gave an interview at the Royal Library. On my way home from that, I was walking with a Facebook acquaintance of mine, a friend of mine, who asked me, how did your interest in the conflict begin? And really, I couldn't remember. I had to stop and think about it for a minute. I was always interested in the Middle East, but not necessarily in politics in that way. But one thing I remember vividly was avidly reading Noam Chomsky. And through Noam Chomsky, I got to learn about Norman Finkelstein. Like many people in my generation, I was politicized, or to use a more mundane term, I was radicalized by the war on terror. I thought it was deeply wrong. And not just wrong as in tactically wrong, it was fundamentally wrong and immoral. So through Chomsky and Finkelstein, I learned to tackle these subjects, and not just in denouncing them, but actively resisting them, politically and intellectually. If political science and global studies students received Andrew Haywood's 17th edition Compendium of Politics, I had Chomsky's Fateful Triangle, and I had Finkelstein's Beyond Chutzpah, which they don't teach you at political science. There's a lot to learn there, I think, in my opinion. Chomsky and Finkelstein are naturally different in style and tone. One is dry on the surface and ironic. The other is polemical and uncompromising. Yet their method is very close. They both study the chasm between image and reality by careful attention to the facts. This places them, I think, squarely in the critical realist tradition. But it doesn't end there. Having separated fact from myth, Chomsky and Finkelstein then go on to subjecting a much less ideal reality, which they've just discerned, to an unwavering ethical reflection. In this respect, in fact, they often, though not always, take the company of those in power who claim to pursue agendas that are consistent with these same ethical values: truth, justice, democracy, and freedom. Speaking in terms of method alone, not at University, this is critical realism subjected to practical idealism. In short, it's the vocation of the scholar-activist. I don't mean that in a demeaning way. Norman Finkelstein, although he's much known for heated YouTube videos and debates, in fact has an impeccable and unimpeached academic record, both as a scholar and as a teacher. He received his doctorate in 1988 at the University of Princeton, at the Department of Politics there. He wrote his dissertation on the political ideology of Zionism. Shortly after that, Finkelstein made his name by exposing an academic fraud, a fraud published and much lauded as fact by the intellectual community. This fraud was Joel Peters' 1984 book, From Time Immemorial, which claimed that the Arabs of Palestine were not descendants of Palestine at the time of the formation of Israel, but had arrived there in waves of immigration after Israel made the desert bloom. Finkelstein had devoted 2 months in the New York Public Library to systematically going through all of Peters' documentation for her central thesis. There he discovered that every single piece of evidence in support of her thesis was falsified, even plagiarized from ludicrous Zionist pamphlets. Finkelstein immediately brought his findings to the attention of 20 or so publications and to several individuals whom he thought would find his discovery of interest. Only Noam Chomsky would respond, warning him in effect that it would amount to academic suicide. Peters' book received rave reviews in academia and in the media, and especially by intellectuals. Norman Finkelstein was subsequently known as the person who meticulously exposed this book's spurious scholarship and in extension, the intellectuals who lauded it. Today, he's the author of 10 books, more than 10 books, that have been translated into 50 foreign languages, and numerous academic articles and review essays. Some of these books are The Rise and Fall of Palestine, a personal account of the Intifada years, Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine conflict, Beyond Chutzpah on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history, and Method and Madness, the hidden story of Israel's assault on Gaza. Among his most influential academic articles, aside from his expose of Peters, I'll just mention a few, was History's Verdict, the Cherokee case from 1995, in which Finkelstein compares the fate of the Cherokees with that of the Palestinians, or the other way around. His prospects for ending the occupation in 2003, and also his criticism of the Goldhagen thesis with Ruth Bettina Byrne in 1998. Finkelstein doesn't only write on the Israel-Palestine conflict and on Jewish American political culture, he's also written essays and taught classes on American freedom, academic freedom, on the utility of labels, on John Stuart Mill, Machiavelli, Plato, and Mahatma Gandhi. Those of you acquainted with Finkelstein's writings will know he's a vociferous reader. Oftentimes, a single paragraph of his book is predicated on hundreds of pages of human rights reports. I'll give you an example. After Operation Cast Lead, the Israeli invasion in Gaza in 2008 and 2009, I was researching a particular Israeli talking point. The idea that the reason that so many civilians had died was because the Palestinians hid behind civilian shields. So I did what any serious person would do. I turned to Norman Finkelstein's book on the Gaza invasion. This time we went too far. Chapter 4, page 86, note 1. Note 1 refers to 8 human rights reports, each running up to approximately 200 pages. One UN Commission report, 545 pages. And a couple of reports by security analysts, similarly running up a couple hundred pages. All packed up in this one note. And he doesn't just name drop like many academics do. He points the reader directly to the pages and paragraphs, and tediously backs up every claim he makes, small or large. Such massive notes are reminiscent, in fact, of Jewish scholarship on the Torah. In Finkelstein, such notes are no exceptions. They're the norm throughout his books. To repeat what the eminent historian of the Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, once said about Norman Finkelstein, Finkelstein displays academic courage to speak the truth when no one else is there to support him. His place in the whole history of writing history is assured, and those who in the end are proven right triumph. And Finkelstein will be among those who have triumphed, albeit it so seems at great cost. We're lucky to have such a figure come speak to us today. Professor Finkelstein will speak about the origins of the conflict, and he will conclude with prospects of ending the conflict. He will be speaking for an hour, after which we will have a short break and go directly to questions and answers. So without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Norman Finkelstein.
Thank you for having me. I had to think about what to speak about this afternoon, and we're in the year 2017 now, and it happens that there's a cluster of milestones this year pertaining to the Israel-Palestine conflict. As many of you in the audience know, it's 100 years, the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, which was really the major impetus to the process that climaxed in the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, and also the dispossession of the indigenous population, which set in motion another process which we continue to live with today. It's 70 years, it's 7 decades after the partition resolution, when the United Nations tried to resolve the conflict that had developed in Palestine by dividing Palestine into two states, what are called a Jewish state and an Arab state, though it should be noted that the partition resolution never clearly stated what it meant by a Jewish state and an Arab state, other than the fact that in the Jewish state, the Jews would be a tiny majority of the population. But aside from the demographic majority, and only by a small number, they never really indicated what they meant by a Jewish state. It's 50 years. Wait, am I supposed to be doing something here?
If you want, otherwise I can.
I think you should do it. Yeah. Would you like me to switch and go over
Yes.
there? Okay. Because we have some illustrations in order to rivet your attention. So let's get that Balfour Declaration up there. I have to assume a very wide range of knowledge because there's a very wide range of age cohorts in the room. So if at some point you have no idea to what I'm referring, it may be useful just to raise your hand. Don't be embarrassed because you're here to enlighten yourself. So if there's something, a reference I'm making, you could just go like that, and I'll know I have to stop and just clarify. So it's, as I said, 100 years after the Balfour Declaration issued by the British Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour, 70 years after the UN Partition Resolution, and then it's a half century, it's 50 years after the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in the June 1967 war. And then it's 30 years after the First Intifada, the Palestinian Popular Revolt against the Israeli occupation, which, as it happened, began in Gaza. My memory is it's Jabalia camp. It began on December 7th, 1987. And then it's 10 years after Israel imposed the hermetic blockade of Gaza, shortly after Hamas took full control over Gaza in 2007 after an attempted coup, or to stop an attempted coup that was orchestrated by the United States and some elements among the Palestinian leadership. In my remarks this evening, I want to focus on that half-century milestone, namely the beginning of the occupation. And that's a practical choice. It's not a moral or a philosophical one. We're here, most of us here, I suppose, are not just to be educated, but also because they feel a certain kind of moral passion or concern about what's going on in that part of the world. And if you have a concern, then obviously you want to turn it into something that can lessen the suffering. That's what I have tried to do with my adult life. I'm not much interested in academic seminars. I'm much more concerned with trying to lessen human suffering. And with that in mind, I don't see much point, and of course we can disagree, and there will be people in this room who will disagree with me. I don't think there's much point in focusing on that centenary the Balfour Declaration because it set in motion a process which, in my opinion, cannot be reversed. It set in motion the process which culminated, climaxed in the creation of the State of Israel, and that, in my opinion, is a fact, whether one likes it or not, whether it should be reversed or not be reversed, whether one likes it or not, it is a fact now and an unmovable fact. And therefore, for political purposes, it's not particularly useful to go back to the Balfour Declaration. On the other hand, the occupation, which began in 1967, the occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, I think there are prospects for its reversal. Now, some of you may think that my claim is arbitrary, but I would have to differ on that, and I'll try to explain why in some simple words. The occupation has lasted for a half century. The international community has never accepted the permanence of the occupation. At least on paper, there is a consensus that the occupation has to be undone. Nonetheless, even though Palestinians have struggled and sacrificed for that half century, the occupation is more entrenched than ever. It's more difficult now than at any time in the past to reverse it. In fact, for all the struggle and sacrifice, not a single inch of the West Bank or Gaza has been undone. And now you have to ask yourself a simple question. If the occupation enjoys no international legitimacy at all and remains firmly entrenched after a half century, how can one realistically hope to undo a state whose origins go back a full century and enjoys full international legitimacy? If you can't undo an occupation thus far, you haven't been able to undo it. It's lasted a half century and has no international legitimacy. How can one really realistically expect to undo a state that goes back a full century and has complete international legitimacy? The Israeli economy is thriving as we speak. Per capita, it's wealthier than Italy and Spain. And while there is a lot of criticism of Israel in the international community, the support for eliminating Israel as a state can be calculated down to the decimal point. The support for eliminating Israel as a state is 0.0. You can see that in any United Nations General Assembly vote, which includes states like the Islamic State of Iran. If you look at the UN vote, it's not advocating the elimination of the state of Israel. It's advocating, like every other state on earth, except for the United States, Israel, and some South Pacific islands, it's advocating 2 states. So I don't think it makes much political sense to focus on trying to undo what happened in 1917, though I do believe, for reasons which I'll get to at the end, it makes political sense to try to undo what happened in 1967. But before I get there, because time has elapsed And many of the people in this room are of a generation which has barely a memory of the events of the past half century. And what you do know, I suspect, is corrupted by an awful lot of very effective propaganda. What I want to do in the first part, and the bulk of my remarks this afternoon, is to go through that history, what actually happened in the past half century. And I want to begin with the beginning of the occupation in 1967. Obviously, this is not the venue, the circumstance to footnote everything I'm about to say, but I will be happy if people want to question my claims or have doubts. I'll be happy to point to you the scholarly literature and to the extent that my memory is capable to simply cite the sources and you ask me. Israel claimed in 1967, and it's still said to this day, that in 1967 it faced what it called an existential threat, a threat to its survival. Abba Eban, who was the very distinguished and eloquent Israeli foreign minister, he once said, which was actually remarkable for him because what he said was true, Abba Eban said, "The purpose of a diplomat is to convince others of what you don't believe yourself." And he was very effective at that. I guess he knew something on the order of 12 or 14 languages, graduated with triple firsts at Cambridge. He was a very impressive guy. He was the UN representative for Israel in 1967, went on to be its foreign minister. And in one of his memoirs, he described the 67 war as to live or to die. That was the choice that Israel was facing. And that's what we're told till this day. But what does the record show? Israel didn't have any existential threat in 1967. The claim was that the Egyptian president, Mr. Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and neighboring Arab states were going to throw Israel into the Jews into the sea. In fact, the record is pretty clear. Number one, not going through the background, number one, Egypt was not going to attack Israel. And number two, it was clear that even if Egypt attacked, and even if it attacked together with neighboring Arab states, it would be easily defeated by the Israeli army. We know that because at the time, the big fear of Israel was not that they were going to be destroyed or swept into the sea. Their big fear was that there would be a repeat of 1956 when Israel invaded Egypt and the American president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, ordered Israel to leave. And they were afraid that the Americans would order them to leave again. So in the last 2 weeks in May, they were sending over a lot of their officials, diplomats, army, intelligence people, trying to feel out the Americans. What are they going to do this time? And they came to the White House and they sat down with the US President Lyndon Johnson, and they said, "We face an existential threat that Mr. Nasser," who was called back then the Hitler of the Nile, that Nasser was going to attack. So Lyndon Johnson, he went to his intelligence community, and there were about six or so intelligence units he consulted. They all said the same thing. They said, Nasser is not going to attack. And then Mr. Johnson, or President Johnson, turned to the Israelis and he said, according to all of our intelligence, if he attacks, meaning Nasser, or even if he attacks with Jordan and Syria, and now I'm quoting Johnson, he said, according to all of our intelligence, you're going to whip the hell out of them, which of course is exactly what happened. In fact, the defense secretary at the time was a fellow named Robert McNamara, and he said that the war would last between 7 and 10 days, and Israel would win. And he was always proud of the fact later in life that he predicted it almost down to the day. The fact of the matter is, as a factual matter, the war lasted 30 minutes, because the moment Israel launched its war, it knocked out the entire Egyptian Air Force, and the war was over. It was actually over in 30 minutes. The only reason it lasted 6 days is because Israel then used the war as an excuse to then conquer the Sinai, and conquer the West Bank, and to conquer Gaza, and to conquer the Syrian Golan Heights. As it happens, the Israeli intelligence, head of Israeli Mossad, his name is Major General Meir Amit, he went to Washington on June 1st, just a few days before the war, and he told the Americans, our intelligence completely agrees with yours, which means we too know he's not going to attack, and if he does, then we'll whip the hell out of the Arab so-called armies. Not to go into the technical part, but sometimes the technical part is important. I don't want to belabor it because it will become too long and too detailed. But even if it were true that Israel had launched a war of self-defense, even if that were true, and it's not true, the evidence I think is clear on that, the occupation would at this point in time, 50 years later, the occupation would still be illegal. Because under international law, what makes an occupation, what distinguishes an occupation is it's supposed to be temporary. And if the occupying power persists in its occupation, it's no longer an occupation. What would you call a situation where an occupying power persists in the occupation, refusing to end it? What would you call it? Anyone? Yes, it would be an annexation. And under international law, to quote UN Resolution 242, the landmark resolution on the occupation, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war or to annex territory. So even if it were a defensive war, since Israel has made plain, certainly at this point in time, there can't be any doubt about it any longer, they have no intention of withdrawing, then it's an annexation, and annexations are illegal under international law. The next landmark or milestone was in 1982, and it's a kind of personal milestone also, because that's when I first got involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict in 1982 as the person who made a very generous introduction about me, probably too generous because I'm painfully aware of my limitations, but I'll accept it gracefully, his remarks. I first became something of a modest, minor, but still public figure after exposing a major academic hoax about the Israel-Palestine conflict in 1984. And I first became involved in 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon. I suspect many people in this room aren't even aware of that episode. It's disappeared because so much more blood has passed under the bridge in the meantime. But it was a quite awful attack. The estimates are between 15 and 20,000 Palestinian and Lebanese, overwhelmingly civilians, were killed during the attack. Most of you will perhaps be familiar with the Sabra and Shatila massacres, which climaxed the attack in September 1982, but it lasted 3.5 months, and it was a turning point in many ways in the West, because it was the first major shift in public opinion about Israel in the West. It was widely broadcast, and as I said, it was very ugly with a huge civilian toll. And Israel claimed it attacked Lebanon because of rocket attacks from the north. And most of you will be familiar with that theme of Israel. These aren't rocket attacks from the south, namely Gaza. These were rocket attacks which they claim were coming from the north, namely from South Lebanon to the Galilee, the Israeli Galilee. And the operation was called Operation Peace of the Galilee. They said that the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which at that point was headquartered in Lebanon, was launching these terrible attacks on Israel, and it had to defend itself. The facts, as often is the case in Israel-Palestine conflict, are precisely, they're the reverse. The border between Israel and Lebanon was absolutely quiet for a year. A ceasefire had been signed between the PLO and Israel. It was indirect agreement was signed between them. The PLO was absolutely scrupulous in obeying the terms of the ceasefire. All of this is familiar for those of you, for example, who remember Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, where just like in Lebanon in 1982, in Operation Cast Lead in June 2008, a ceasefire was signed. Hamas was absolutely scrupulous in obeying the terms of the ceasefire. But just like in Cast Lead in 1982 in Lebanon, Israel was seized by a panic. And it's interesting the language that the Israelis used to describe the panic. They were panicked by what they called, and now I'm quoting Israel's leading political scientist at the time, Avner Yaniv. They were seized with panic because of the PLO's, and now I'm using their expression, their peace offensive. Their peace offensive. They were terrified by the fact that the PLO was becoming too moderate. And when the PLO becomes too moderate, international pressure begins to exert itself on Israel. You have to negotiate. They're moderate. Why don't you negotiate with them? And so Israel was seized with panic because the PLO already, back in 1982, it was clearly on record as supporting a two-state settlement of the conflict. And Israel did not want to, as it still doesn't want to, withdraw. And so it attacked the PLO, hoping that if you hit them hard enough, the moderates will be defeated by the radical sectors in the PLO, and that the PLO will terminate its peace offensive. And that's an important point to keep in mind because it's a recurrent theme in the history. Israel doesn't fear radical Palestinians. That's absolutely untrue. What it fears is Palestinians who are too pragmatic, and then they have no excuse for not negotiating. At that point, the war ends in, it wasn't a war, no, it wasn't really a war. These are never wars, these are just high-tech murder machines at play on the Israeli side. But it ends in September 1982 with the Sabra and Shatila massacre, and then there are negotiations, and the PLO leaves Lebanon, or its leadership leaves Lebanon. That's before the Sabra and Shatila massacre, but just around the same time. And when they're leaving, Yasser Arafat, who is the chair, he's holding up the V for victory sign, and he had this kind of weird grin as he's announcing victory, as Palestinians always do, and their leadership always does. And there was a fairly, I think, pretty honest Palestinian leader at the time. His name was Shafiq al-Hut, and he was in charge of the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And he said something which always stuck with me. He said at the time, one more victory like this and we'll end up in Fiji. And every time the Palestinians proclaim another one of their victories, I think about that line of his. There was also the line that they always, every time there's a traffic accident in Tel Aviv, so 3 or 4 Palestinian factions claim responsibility for it. And then when Yasser Arafat married this quite sinister character named Suha Ramawi, correct? Yeah. And then, excuse me? Tawil, yeah, Ramonda Tawil. Yeah, I was thinking of her mother, Ramonda. Yeah, Suha Tawil. And then they announced that a few months later, it was announced that Suha was pregnant, and the joke went, and 3 Palestinian factions took credit for it. And now with the PLO leadership, which was already back then quite corrupt, poisoned and corrupted by the Arab oil money, when they were gone, it looked as if the Palestinian struggle was over. And many people thought it was over back then. I would include among the people who thought it was over, I would include Noam Chomsky, for whom I have the highest regard, and he has extremely shrewd political eye. But if you read The Fateful Triangle, as I did several times, just like the person who introduced me, it was my Bible at the time, as was for members of my family. My late mother read it, was very impressed, and she once went to a library meeting. Some Israeli representative was speaking, and she mentioned Noam Chomsky's book, Fateful Triangle, and the Israeli representative said like this, like, he's cuckoo, he's crazy. And my mother's reply was, but wait, all of his footnotes are to Israelis, which was true. He knows Hebrew. But he was, at the end, he was very pessimistic. And I recall quite vividly that Edward Said, who most of you know, he was the most renowned spokesperson for the Palestinians during this period. He died prematurely from leukemia. He wrote a review of the book when it came out in 1983 in the London Review of Books, and he said that Chomsky he thought was unnecessarily, unjustifiably pessimistic. In this case, he turned out to be right, because in 1987, probably the most heroic chapter in the history of the Palestinian struggle unfolded, which was the First Intifada. And the First Intifada was a nonviolent mass civil resistance to the Israeli occupation. As I mentioned, it began in Gaza by a fluke, an accident. There was a traffic accident. Several Palestinians were killed, and it probably was an accident, as far as anyone could tell. It wasn't, premeditated murder by the Israelis. It was an accident, but it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And then you had this mass uprising, nonviolent civil resistance. I spent off and on a lot of time there during the First Intifada. I lived in Fawar camp outside Al-Khalil, Hebron, and I lived in Beit Sahur, which is a small Christian village outside Bethlehem. And what was most inspiring for me, and also a little sobering, because when you think about mass struggles and resistance, you kind of think about people who are kind of special, unique. But they were just completely ordinary people. There was nothing special about them. They were like you, your mothers, your fathers, your neighbors. And suddenly, they just were willing to give their all to end the occupation. Now, as I said yesterday evening, I have no illusions about myself, and I accept myself in the wholeness of my being. I have to do that at this point in my life, because soon my being will be non-being. So I might as well accept it at this point. I'm totally uncourageous, but I remember episodes, just a couple, I'll just mention. One was, I was in a refugee camp. It was Jalazon refugee camp. We went to visit the housekeeper of my friend, Samira Abu Haj. Her family owned the National Palace Hotel in Jerusalem, which was a well-known hotel. It's since closed down. And we went to visit her. Her home had been demolished because at that point, one of Israel's typical forms of punishment was to blow up the homes of people who were who were just charged, not found guilty yet, just charged with throwing stones. And we went to visit her, and as we were exiting the refugee camp, the kids, they were called at that time the Shabab, the young kids, they were burning a tire on the road. And then the Israeli jeep came by. It wasn't in any danger at all. And then they came out of the jeep and they started to fire. Well, my first instinct, as you can imagine, was to run, which was actually the wrong thing to do. You were supposed to lie down flat on the ground, but I didn't know what to do. I'm from Brooklyn. I can tell you about how to board a subway, but that's about it. And I remember I ran inside the camp, and I was stood up against the wall like this, totally terrified. A kid was shot. The bullet entered his back. You saw it come out of his stomach. And all these old women wearing the veil and dressed conservatively, around 4 or 5 women, in the hail of bullets, because the Israelis were shooting wildly, they went right out to get the kid and bring him in and then bring him to some medical care. Didn't think twice. I mean, there I was, the big hero, scared to death. And they just, you go, you get the kid. Simple as that. Ordinary people. Really, it's sobering, especially when people praise me for my courage. No, I know what real courage is. I've seen it. I remember I lived with a woman, her husband worked in the Gulf. And strangely enough, she took me into her home. She had 3 kids. Her name was Nadal Barham. She taught English at Talitha Kumi, which was a German Lutheran school in Beit Jala, next door to Beit Sahur. She was very angry. She was angry, very smart, very good English. Not as good as yours, Mohammed, but very good English. And very angry. Her 2 brothers were in jail at that point for 10 years. They had gotten arrested much earlier in really brutal conditions because I went there once to visit them with her. So she was very angry, but smart, very smart, and eloquent. And I remember once, at that time it was illegal for Palestinians to hoist the flag. If they put a Palestinian flag on a telephone pole, it was illegal, and you can get shot to death for it. It was legal to shoot a person to death. In this case, the jeep came by and ordered the kid, it was typical at that time, to climb the pole to take down the flag. And it was dangerous because the poles were electrified. And I remember she was like Nidal. We were in the living room looking out the window, and there was the kid climbing the pole. He brings down the flag, and she sort of like gets this look in her eye, a mad look in her eyes. And she started to shout, "Busa, Busa, kiss the flag, kiss the flag." Well, I'm thinking these Israelis are going to take their guns and, shoot us. I was scared. But everyone was like that. Her mother-in-law, when the kid was being ordered to climb up, the mother-in-law turned to her and said, "Don't tell that child to do that." And they said, "Who are you?" And she said, "God is stronger than you." Everybody was just ready to give their all. And they gave Israel a very hard time. Israel was very much on the defensive at that moment. I remember I was teaching a class in Brooklyn College at the time. And Brooklyn College was a crazy place. Its 3 most famous graduates were Meir Kahane, who was the founder of the Jewish Defense League, complete lunatic. Baruch Goldstein, who was responsible for the Hebron massacre in 1994, where he killed 27 Palestinians who were praying in the Hebron Mosque. And the 3rd most famous of his graduates is Alan Dershowitz. And I was teaching there. And I remember once while teaching, there were a large number of students in the classroom who were driving me mad, defending Israel, which is just fine, but not the way they did it, which was very disrespectful, and I tried to not remember it. But a non-Jewish student, once he stood up, he says, "Well, stone Uzi," the Uzi was the Israeli machine gun, "that's not fair," because the symbol of the Palestinian resistance at that time was children throwing stones and Israelis with their Uzis. So Israel had a very hard time, and without going into the details, there was a real possibility back then of forcing an Israeli withdrawal through the protracted nonviolent resistance for reasons which I can't go into now. It didn't happen. And unfortunately, most Palestinians remember that chapter not as a great victory, which it was, but as a great defeat, because it culminated in 1993 with the Oslo Accord, which was signed between Mr. Arafat, the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and the American President Bill Clinton. The Oslo Accord, we're told it was supposed to bring peace. That was its aim. In fact, again, and to end the Israeli occupation. But again, unfortunately, the reverse was the case. The purpose of the Oslo Agreement was very straightforward. The Israelis were very honest about it. One thing about the Israelis, until very recently, the Israelis were very honest about what their motives were. It changed, if you like, I'll elaborate on it later. It changed after Operation Cast Lead, because it was the first time after Cast Lead where it looked like Israeli leaders were going to be prosecuted. If you recall, after the Richard Goldstone report, for some of you who know the details, then there was all this talk about Israelis being prosecuted, and suddenly they discovered, we better not say these things in public anymore, because it's going to get us in trouble. But up until then, they were pretty straightforward. So when Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was asked, what's the purpose of the Oslo Accord? He was very honest about it. He said, we're getting all this bad publicity for killing Palestinians, for torturing Palestinians. All these human rights organizations are issuing all these reports saying, which was true, that we had tortured tens of thousands of Palestinian detainees, which is what Human Rights Watch said, and Amnesty International said, and Israel's own human rights organization, B'Tselem, said. So he says, we're getting all this bad publicity. So what can we do about it? Well, the obvious thing is, let's hire somebody else to do the torture. Let's hire somebody else to do the killing. And the obvious candidate was, let's hire the PLO. Because the PLO is now bankrupt. 1993 comes after the first Gulf War. And the first Gulf War, Mr. Arafat made a major political error. He supported Saddam Hussein and Iraq after Iraq had occupied Kuwait. And as a result of that, the Gulf states cut off all of their financial support to the PLO. So now the PLO was broke. And Arafat, without money to corrupt, is like a fish without water. And so the PLO was desperate. And they were given an offer by the Israelis and the Americans. And the offer was, if you switch sides, we'll support you. We'll give you the money, and your organization will continue. So when Prime Minister Rabin was asked, why are you signing this accord? We're told it's because they wanted peace, end the occupation. But here's what Rabin said, and now I'm quoting him verbatim. Palestinians will be better at establishing internal security, meaning in the occupied territories, than we were. They will rule by their own methods, freeing the Israeli soldiers from having to do what Palestinians will do. Human rights groups and all those sorts of groups of mothers and fathers and bleeding hearts will cease criticizing conditions in the occupied territories. The moment you have Arabs torturing Arabs, Arabs killing Arabs, nobody cares anymore. So let's hire them to do the dirty work, and in return, this new elite got all the privileges, the perquisites of power, and now are quite firmly entrenched. Oslo Accord is often said, the Oslo Agreement is often said to be a failure because it didn't result in peace. In fact, it was a fantastic, a spectacular success. It was a real gamble by the Israelis. Remember, this is the PLO, the terrorist organization. It's the equivalent then of what Hamas is now. And we're going to take a chance. We're going to give them the weapons and we're going to coordinate with them to preserve the occupation. It was a real chance they took. It was a gamble. It was a very smart gamble. It succeeded. It didn't succeed exactly, however, as they would have preferred, because they wanted the agreement in writing. It's one thing to have an informal agreement with the PLO, but they want to have the occupation declared legally over, and for them to keep the parts of the West Bank and Gaza that they wanted. And that's what happens in 2001, the Camp David Accord. The Israelis, the Americans, and the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, they meet and they try to sign an agreement. And what's usually said is that Israelis made a generous offer, and the Palestinians, in particular Yasser Arafat, rejected it. Is that what happened? Well, the first phase of this Camp David ends in July 2000, and Israel's foreign minister at the time, Shlomo Ben-Ami, I once debated him on this program, Democracy Now!, and I have to say he was very serious. I had to respect the fact that, unlike other people I've debated, he didn't carry on that I was a liar, I was making up facts, and so on and so forth. Not once, in a quite protracted debate, not once did he question any of the claims I was making. He was disagreeing with me, but he wasn't claiming that what I was saying was not true. In any case, in the course of the debate, he said, and now I'm quoting him, this is, remember, the foreign minister who was negotiating at Camp David. He said, if I were a Palestinian, I would have rejected Camp David as well. Even he acknowledged there was no generous offer at Camp David. It's complete mythology. In fact, throughout the conflict, again, it would take me time to spell out the details, but throughout the conflict, if you look at what the legal rights, the rights under international law of the two sides to the conflict, all the concessions, every single one, all the concessions have always come from the Palestinian side. Israel has never made any concessions, and if there's anybody in this audience who would like to challenge me on that point, I would actually be interested. I've studied the record very carefully. According to the law, not according to what Israel would like, and that is, it's willing to accept less than it likes. Yes, it's true. It's willing to accept less than it likes. But if you use as the standard not what Israel wants, but what the law says, by that standard, they've never made any concessions. And that law was clarified beyond any doubt in another historic milestone, historic milestone is redundant, another milestone in 2004 when the International Court of Justice ruled on the legality of the wall that Israel has been building in the West Bank. Again, without going into the details, just to clarify what it found, number one, that the whole of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, are occupied Palestinian territories. It found that all the settlements in the occupied territories are illegal under international law. So on the question of settlements, Israel lost completely. On the question of Jerusalem, Israel lost completely. On the question of borders, Israel lost completely. The whole of the West Bank and Gaza are occupied Palestinian territories. East Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory. The settlements are illegal under international law on every point. Now, some of you may say, well, the International Court of Justice, you know, like everybody else, they're just a bunch of anti-Semites. Well, that's just not really believable for the following reason. Number one, there are 15 judges that sit on the court. They represent 15 different countries in the world, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and then the additional ones. Number two, 2 of the judges on the court were Jewish. Rosalind Higgins, she was the British judge. She's married to an Irishman. She's Jewish. And Thomas Bergenthal, who was both Jewish and he's a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. On all the questions which I just went through, there was no disagreement. That's very unusual in the International Court of Justice. There's always a couple of people who disagree, and usually it's, well, I won't say usually, but often it's quite close. Here it was unanimous. Bergenthal disagreed on some points in the what's called the majority opinion, but not on the settlements, not on East Jerusalem, or not on the borders. It was unanimous. The Israeli position legally has no standing in the international community, 0 standing. The only question that remained of the main questions, which are settlements, borders, Jerusalem, the other major question is the refugees, the question of the right of the return of the refugees. And there, the leading human rights organizations, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, in 2000 and 2001, they came out in support of the Palestinian right of return. Now, you may say it's impractical. It's an argument there. But we're talking about the legality. Legally, it's a Palestinian right. You may say they have to negotiate that right. Okay, I could see an argument there. But on the question of the law, which is the only relevant standard in the modern world, on the question of the law, all the concessions came from the Palestinian side. None came from the Israeli side and never have. One last point before I get to the Gaza part, which is because we have to be clear about how we got to the mess we're in today, where the Palestine cause is at a very low point, a nadir. The Israelis were very afraid of that wall ruling. And they were debating, should we go before the court or not? Because they have the option of not even appearing before the court, because it was an opinion that was being debated, and they have the option of not showing up. They were very scared, because they were afraid, this may turn out to be like the Balfour Declaration and the Partition Resolution, that the Palestinians will be able to use it against us in the court of public opinion. So they decide we'll go to one phase of the court hearing, but not the other. I won't bother with the technicalities. The interesting thing is the Palestinians won. It was an amazing victory. As I've tried to convey to you, they won on everything. The court declared the wall was illegal. The court declared the wall had to be dismantled. The court declared that if Israel didn't dismantle the wall, the international community had to make sure the wall was dismantled. They declared that Israel had to pay reparations for the destruction it caused by building the wall. What happened? The Palestinians won this incredible victory. They took the piece of paper, they filed it in their drawer, and you never heard about it again. They didn't do anything with it. Everybody in this room, I'm sure, has heard of the Balfour Declaration. Everybody in this room has heard of the Partition Resolution. I bet you, with the exception of maybe 5 people, nobody has heard of the Wall decision of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. Palestinians didn't do anything with it. They just collect their money and deposit it in Swiss bank accounts, unfortunately. And the last of the period that I want to look at is the Gaza massacres, with an emphasis on the plural. Gaza is among the most densely populated areas on the planet. It's more populated than Tokyo. About 2/3 of the population consists of refugees or children of refugees, and half the population consists of children under the age of 18. This population, which is predominantly refugees, predominantly children. In the past 12 years, it's been the object of not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6, not 7. It's been the object of 8 Israeli, as they call them, operations. They always have colorful names for their operations. 2004, Operation Rainbow. 2004, Operation Days of Penitence. 2006, Operation Summer Rains. 2006, Operation Autumn Clouds. 2008, Operation Hot Winter. 2008-9, Operation Cast Lead. 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense. 2014, Operation Protective Edge. Those are the operations, as Israel likes to call them. And then the operations, they just punctuate. They come at certain junctures in this decade-long blockade of Gaza, which is illegal under international law. It's immoral by any standard. It's a real ongoing crime. Palestinians, between operations, they can't rebuild because of the blockade. You can't bring in the necessary material to rebuild. So after Operation Cast Lead, there was 600,000 tons of rubble left behind. About 6,300 homes were destroyed. Come Operation Protective Edge, in August 2014, there's 2.5 million tons of rubble left behind and 18,000 homes destroyed. Lest there be any doubt, I want to just clarify. When you talk about homes destroyed, you're talking about the homes of refugees who lost their homeland and now are losing their homes that they rebuilt after being expelled from their homeland. The numbers, sometimes you can't really capture what that means. Most of you here, you have computers, I assume, and you're working on a project, maybe 2 or 3 hours. And if you're anyone like me, 2 or 3 hours, you're working on a project, and suddenly you press the wrong key, and you lose it. And then you go into a panic. You go into a hysteria. You start pitying yourself. There is no God. How can life be so cruel? You want to curse everybody who's ever inhabited this planet. You've lost 3 hours of work. It's just crushing, devastating. I'm laughing now, but you should watch me when I lose 3 hours of work. And here they lose their homes. Everything, all their possessions, just reduced to rubble. Now, lest there be any doubt, it's not an accident or collateral damage of war That's not how it happens. It would be awful enough if that's how it happened, but that's not how it happens. We have the testimonies of all the Israeli soldiers. They go into neighborhoods, rope off the neighborhoods, send in the D9 bulldozers, and systematically and methodically level the homes, demolish the homes, whole areas. In some areas, of course, it is aerial devastation. You take the place of Shujaya. It's a tiny little place in tiny Gaza. Has about 90,000 inhabitants, very densely populated. During Operation Protective Edge, Israel dropped on little Shujaya 120 one-ton bombs. 120 one-ton bombs on Shujaya. But that's not actually, even though it was horrible what happened there, that's actually not how most of the devastation happens. Most of the devastation happens just very systematically going from neighborhood to neighborhood and just leveling everything. Israel alleges that it launches these attacks to stop Hamas rocket attacks, like attacked Lebanon in 1982 to stop the PLO Katyusha attacks. But as I said earlier, in Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, it was preceded by a ceasefire. Israeli intelligence said, and now I'm quoting them, Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. How did the ceasefire end? There's no mystery about it. Israelis are very good at public relations. They know the media very well, especially the Western media. They wanted to attack Gaza for reasons which I can't go into right now, but I'll be happy during questions and answers. They patiently wait, because there's a ceasefire. So you can't just attack because it's going to look bad. So you have to find the right moment. They wait until November 4th, 2008, which some of you might know, was the US election day. And all the cameras were riveted on the American election because Mr. Obama was running for office, and there was a good possibility the first African-American president would be elected. They waited for that day, November 4th, and then they attacked Gaza and killed several Hamas militants in a border raid. Knowing exactly what was going to happen, Hamas would retaliate. Everybody's going to forget about the original Israeli attack because it was an election day. There's no coverage of it. And then they launched their attack. 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense. How did Operation Pillar of Defense begin? It's interesting. It began when Israel assassinated the Hamas leader Ahmed al-Jabari. Who was Ahmed al-Jabari? Of course, nobody in this room knows except Mohammed. So I'll describe him as Israel's most distinguished newspaper described him. He was a subcontractor for Israel in charge of maintaining Israel's security in Gaza. In fact, when Israel assassinated him, and now I'm quoting the Israeli paper, Haaretz, Jabari was in the process of advancing a permanent ceasefire agreement with Israel. They assassinated the person who was maintaining peace along the border just at the moment that he was negotiating a permanent ceasefire agreement. Well, that doesn't sound like self-defense. Israel uses Gaza as its favorite punching bag. It commits massacres in Gaza to restore what it calls its deterrence capacity. That's the fancy technical term for making sure that the Arab world fears it. And it wants to keep its deterrence capacity without suffering any real casualties and damage. So it attacks Gaza, for example, in 2008-9, Operation Protective Cast Lead. Why does it attack? because it suffered a major defeat in Lebanon in 2006. In its attack on Lebanon, the Party of God, the Hezbollah, gave them a very hard time. And they were worried because the head of the Hezbollah, Sayed Nasrallah, he was going around talking about what he called, and I'm quoting him, our divine victory. Hezbollah's divine victory. Well, Israel didn't like that because now the Arabs might be getting too uppity talking about victories against our army. So we have to put them in their place. But we don't want to do it in Lebanon because Israelis like to go to discotheques. They don't like to have to fight real enemies. And nobody wants to go into battle with the Hezbollah. They're quite serious characters. So they decide to instead attack Gaza. As one Israeli put it in 2008, he said, remember, Israel's real foe is not Hamas. It is the memory of 2006. We have to erase the memory of our defeat, and we'll do it by crushing the Arabs, as they're called, in Gaza. Yes?
5 minutes.
Okay. Let me just, I'm going to end, and I'll do it in the 5 minutes. I'm just going to save the second part for questions and answers, okay? Is there any element of self-defense in the Israeli claim? Well, many of you will say, what about the Hamas rockets? Isn't Israel defending itself against the Hamas rockets? But in fact, there are no Hamas rockets. It's just a myth. I know many of you will probably be surprised at that claim of mine, but then you just have to look, you have to sort out the physical evidence. Are there Hamas rockets? So you're going to judge for yourself. Let's take the last attack, Operation Protective Edge, in July, August 2014. The official UN statistics say that Hamas fired 5,000 rockets and 2,000 mortar shells at Israel. That's the numbers. And then you go as I did, to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It had a website which was called the Daily Diary. And the Daily Diary listed all the death and destruction inflicted on Israel by these rocket attacks. So I'm looking at the diary, and I notice it lasted 51 days, 5,000 rockets, 2,000 mortar shells, and you look at the diary, only one Israeli house was destroyed. Well, that doesn't make very much sense. You know, when you think about a rocket, I think about something that goes from here to there. It's a rocket. So how could only one house have been destroyed? Well, you know, the Israelis have an answer for everything. So they say, oh, that's because of our Iron Dome anti-missile defense system. And of course, it was a work of genius because Israelis developed it, and anything Israelis do is genius. But there was a problem with that argument. The Iron Dome was only deployed in major population areas in Israel. And according to Israeli official statistics, Iron Dome deflected 830 Hamas rockets. So already you have a problem because that still leaves thousands of rockets which weren't deflected by Iron Dome. In fact, it didn't even deflect 830. One of the world's leading anti-missile defense experts, Theodore Postel at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who has a very good reputation, he said they probably deflected about 40 or 50 rockets. But let's use their number because they're geniuses, So let's use 850. That still leaves thousands of rockets that weren't deflected. So how could only one house have been destroyed? In fact, 60% of those Hamas rockets, 60% landed in the border area between, along the border with Gaza, where there was no Iron Dome. So how come no houses were destroyed? It's true Israel has a very efficient civil defense system, and that would explain why only 6 civilians were killed. But everybody in this room knows houses don't go into shelters. Businesses don't go into shelters. How did only one house get destroyed? Well, the answer is very simple. There's only one possible answer. They're not rockets. They're fireworks. They're enhanced fireworks. Unfortunately, in my opinion, Hamas, because it wants to prove armed resistance works, it claims these are rockets, and then Israel exploits the false claims of Hamas to say we're acting in self-defense. And because of the time limitation, I'm just going to end on one last point. Israel alleges that it always uses proportionate force and only targets Hamas militants, that if other people get killed, it's collateral damage, we didn't intend it, and so on and so forth. Okay, let's take what I would think you would all agree would be the most reliable testimony on this point. Let's see what the Israeli soldiers themselves said. Because after each of these Israeli assaults on Gaza, Israelis, some of them, gather testimony. What did the soldiers experience? What did they witness? What happened during the attack? So let's listen to what the Israelis themselves said, what they experienced. After Operation Protective Edge, they gave their testimonies. They're collected in this volume called Breaking the Silence. It's very interesting to read because everything I'm going to tell you now, none of it is said with guilt, remorse, embarrassment, contrition. If you read it, they just matter-of-factly describe what happened. These are not like guilty, leftist, liberal, bleeding heart Israelis. These are just run-of-the-mill soldiers, candidly and casually describing what happened. Soldier, when we left after the operation, Gaza was just a barren stretch of desert. We spoke about it a lot amongst ourselves. I quote, "Listen, man, it's crazy what went on there. Fuck, check it out. There's nothing at all left. It's nothing but desert now. That's crazy." Soldier, I remember that the level of destruction looked insane to me. Soldier, we entered Gaza with an insane amount of firepower. Soldier, it all looked like a science fiction movie. Serious levels of destruction, everywhere. Everything was really in ruins. Soldier, a crazy amount of artillery was fired at the entire area. Those guys were trigger happy, totally crazy. Soldier, you saw crazy wreckage. It was a real trip. Soldier, our view was of the center of the strip. Let's say it was a real fireworks display. From a distance, it looked pretty cool. Soldier, you're shooting at everything that moves, and also what isn't moving. Crazy amounts. it also becomes a bit like a computer game, totally cool and real. Soldier, it was total destruction in there. I never saw anything like it. Soldier, it's destruction on a whole other level. Soldier, the Air Force carries out an insane amount of strikes in the Gaza Strip. Soldier, shells are being fired all the time. Even if we aren't actually going to enter, shells, shells, shells. What happens is, for 7 straight days, it's nonstop bombardment. That's what happens in Gaza. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for letting me be the first one to talk. Unfortunately, my English is not as good as yours, Norman, but I'll try my best. I have 1 comment and 3 questions, if it's possible. Okay, I'll put the 3 in 1 question. The first comment is, I could see that you like Gaza, and you have a friend from Gaza here. I would like to suggest you to have 1 more guest from Gaza who is sitting there. He is also from Gaza. This is only for a start to start the talk.
Maybe he or she can identify him or herself. Do you know Muhammad? That's not possible because Muhammad told me he knows everyone.
We will know him today, perhaps. The question is, or the questions are, you told us that Israel was established by an UN resolution in 47, and all of it is built on international law. But Israel was established after a long process, which was 50 years before, starting with, as a matter of fact, with the first Zionist international conference in Basel, in something. But the other point which you talked about is 1917, which is the Declaration of Balfour. Balfour Declaration was not an international law. It was, as a matter of fact, a kind of political power processed by political forces at that time, which led to this international law, which means that if you don't accept international or declarations as basis for international law, so that the Israeli establishment at that time was not legal. If you want to take it as it is, as a logical or as a sequence of events. The second question, or which is part of it, the international law have a value of 0 if it's not supported by power, political power, economical power, or perhaps military power. And we have seen this for example, in ex-Yugoslavia. All the laws which have been established there, it was forced by power. And I don't know why the world doesn't use any power, not even economical or political power, to force Palestinians and Israel to accept the international law. The last question, that's the last one. This is the last one, which is very important, I think. I'm Palestinian, I'm Israeli, and I'm Danish. And I have been living in Israel for 28 years. I have Israeli, Jewish Israeli friends, and we have very, very nice relation. I don't know really why the possibility of being one country with 2 nations, which think in democratic way, which put all this historical heritage and religious heritage back. Why it's not so hard to make this? Because the other solution which you are coming is it more difficult and difficult. Thank you.
those are all good questions, and they're reasonable questions, and they can, I think, all be answered in one answer, but it will take some time, and I'll do my best. I don't really think it's any use now to debate whether Israel's founding was legitimate or illegitimate, whether the Balfour Declaration had legitimacy or didn't have legitimacy. The bottom line is Israel is a member state of the United Nations. It has the same standing, the same rights and obligations as any other state in the international system. And it is as legitimate or illegitimate as any other state in the system. Now, if you accept the whole system as it's organized in the world, then you have to accept the standards of legitimacy that are part of that system. You can't accept the whole system and then say this state or that state is illegitimate. It is or isn't as legitimate as any other state in the world system. Now, having said that, the second part of your question was, well, there's an implication in what you say that you don't really accept these standards of legitimacy because what we call legitimacy is really force imposed by the powerful. It's not really law. It's just what the great powers, the big powers, what they decide. And so you don't really accept that kind of legitimacy. And you also suggest it's not going to get the Palestinians anywhere because they don't have the power to enforce the law. So long as the big powers oppose it, they're not going to get anywhere. Then what use is it? Well, here I can only speak from practical experience and not just my own practical experience. So some of you in the audience are perhaps aware that I have had my quarrels, my differences with what's called the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. However, there's one point, in many ways the most fundamental point, where I'm in total agreement with BDS. Because if you look at their platform, the very first sentence of the platform says, we base our program, we base our platform on international law. And in fact, if you look at the record, BDS officially announced its movement and campaign 1 year to the day after the International Court of Justice rendered its advisory opinion. I think it was July 7th, 2004, and BDS officially proclaims itself July 7th, 2005. Some of you are wondering, what's the relevance of that? And that's what I'm going to try to spell out in order to answer your question. You may not like it. It may not be your cup of tea, so to speak. But the only standards that command moral authority, public authority, in the world in which we currently live are the standards of human rights and international law. When a Danish audience, for example, a cross-section of the Danish population, if they hear, this is the law, this is what the International Court of Justice said, or if they hear, this is what Amnesty International said, or Human Rights Watch said, it is a persuasive authority to a broad public opinion. It's more persuasive than any other authority so far as I can judge. And I make that claim on a very simple basis. It's 35 years of experience. When I go out before a public and I invoke the decision of the International Court of Justice, if I cite Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, it commands authority. I become persuasive. If I were to just come out and say, well, this is my opinion, people think, okay, you're entitled to your opinion, I'm entitled to my opinion. If I were a person of great moral standing in the world, if you are a Nelson Mandela, a Bishop Tutu, a Noam Chomsky, it is true to say that before a quite large audience, their opinions command as much moral authority as the ICJ. But for most of us, that's not true. We are as persuasive, we are as convincing as the authority we cite. So, what's our goal? You are right. The great powers aren't going to do anything for you on your own. That's true, because Palestine has no particular strategic value, doesn't have oil like Kuwait. So when Kuwait's invaded by Saddam Hussein, well, wait, Kuwait has oil. There's something at stake. What's Palestine? It's nothing. Just a little people and a little parcel of land. So you're not going to get anything from the great powers. That's true. And then what's your only other hope or recourse? Your hope or recourse is that you're going to try to mobilize public opinion and exert pressure. Mobilize public opinion and exert pressure on the great powers, on the UN. Try to get them to do something. And how do you do that? Well, so far as I could tell from my experience, but I mentioned also BDS because even though we've had differences, on one point there's complete agreement. They recognize, because I know the BDS leaders, we go back a long way. I knew them in the early 80s, actually during the Lebanon War. They know the same thing. One of the main BDS leaders, he went to school at Columbia University. He knows the American mentality. He knows the Western mentality. He knows law and invoking law. It's persuasive. So if I could say all 15 judges on the International Court of Justice agree the settlements are illegal, the supporters of Israel in an audience, they have a real problem. What are you going to answer to that? How do you answer it? All of them are anti-Semitic? Well, that's just not persuasive. It's not convincing. And so it seems to me if your goal is to try to organize, mobilize, and galvanize public opinion, to try to exert pressure on your governments, then you have to use the language, the idiom, the lexicon that public opinion is responsive to. And that is, in my experience, that is international law and human rights law. Those work with the public. I never said I support this or I support that, because I happen to think it's completely irrelevant. There's a real problem when you talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. You often ask this question, you're often asked the question, do you support one state or two states? As if politics were a Chinese menu. I'll take one from column A and one from column B. Though I want to forget about menus after last night, but because all I see is that. Well, it's the size of a frog, a dissected frog. But that's not what politics is about. Politics is not about what you like or what I like. Politics is what is politically possible and feasible. Of course, you're going to aim for the maximum that's politically and possible and feasible and conforms to basic principles of justice. It's not going to be justice, but it conforms more or less. That's what politics is. And that means where is the maximum that you can take a public before you start to lose them. And I think you start losing the public when you start presenting solutions which, so far as I can tell, have no public support. I don't see any public support for one state. I look at the UN General Assembly, I look at the International Court of Justice, I look at human rights organizations. They all support two states. There's no support for it. And how are you going to convince a public? I don't think you can. And so I'm not pretending that the law is just. I think it's very limited, in my opinion. There's a thing called the laws of war, which sort of don't make sense to me. The technical English word is it's an oxymoron. War is lawlessness. So how can you have laws of war? It's like etiquette for cannibals. Doesn't make too much sense. But that's what we're given. The framework, I recognize, is quite limited. International law is quite limited. But we also have to recognize, so far as the Palestinian cause is concerned, it's not a disaster. Settlements are illegal. West Bank, Gaza are Palestinian territory. East Jerusalem, Palestinian territory. Palestinians have the right of return. That's the law. It's not bad. It's not everything you want, because some of you are thinking, well, we want the other 78% of Palestine. And yes, I agree. Under the law, that's lost. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But overall, it's not a complete disaster. And anything else, I just don't think has any possibility of reaching a public. That's a judgment. You know, when I was a young man, I was as radical as you come. I was a Maoist, follower of Chairman Mao. You don't know even who he is, most of you in the audience, but Mao Zedong, live like him, dare to struggle, dare to win. And we were out, dictatorship of the proletariat, smash imperialism, capitalism, and all the rest. The bourgeoisie, of course, they had to go. And I've not become less radical. I've become older, less naive. I've not become less radical. It's just times are different. What we thought back then was possible is very different than what's possible now. When I was growing up, China was the cutting edge of world communism. Your generation, China is the cutting edge of world capitalism. The world changed a lot. And then you have a choice. You can say, forget the world. I'm not going to have anything to do with it. Or you accept the world within its limits and then try to do the most you can. In the case of Gaza, it's been a complete disgrace. The international community's more than disgrace, it's criminal. Let's just call it by its term. It's abandonment of Gaza. But even the UN Human Rights Council, which was absolutely awful, the report in Operation Cast Lead was authored by this New York State judge, Mary McGowan Davis. It was ghastly. But even they said, I was quite surprised, even that report said the blockade of Gaza has to be lifted immediately and unconditionally. That was a big surprise. They completely sold out Gaza. But even they had to acknowledge It has to be lifted immediately and unconditionally. Now, the gentleman is quite correct. He can say, okay, they said it, but nothing's been done about it. And that's true. But it is a weapon we have if we use it. The Zionists were very smart. They used every victory they had in their campaigns. That's why everybody knows the Balfour Declaration, why everybody knows the Partition Resolution. But how many people know the International Court of Justice opinion? How many people in this room knows that even the UN Human Rights Council, which is completely sold out, bunch of prostitutes, but they said the blockade has to be lifted immediately and unconditionally. These are weapons. They're weapons to mobilize public opinion and try to create enough pressure from below. They are weapons. And I think we should take advantage of them rather than say, to hell with the law, always acknowledging the law is very limited. I know that.
Well, you spent 1.5 hours telling us why, even though it's clearly and unconditionally described to be unlawful, still it has absolutely no implication, and the Israelis can go on doing this. I was rather hoping you'd say something in the direction of, and therefore it's going to happen like this, but
well, I am happy to discuss that. I do think there are possibilities. I think that if the people of Gaza were to organize mass civil disobedience, if they did as we did in the American Civil Rights Movement, which is what we did do, put children at the front of the demonstrations. That's why when you watch the news footage from the era of the American Civil Rights Movement, you see the fire hoses being aimed at children, because children were put on the front. We shouldn't forget that when we accuse others of exploiting children. Putting children at the front and a mass nonviolent resistance to breaking the blockade, and having the support of a quite formidable solidarity movement in the West. If we work together, I do believe that the blockade can be broken. But the problem is twofold. Number one, the leadership in Gaza is wedded to this idea of what they call armed resistance. They have the legal right to use armed resistance. They have the moral right to use armed resistance. And I'm not afraid at all to say it, and on every occasion when I'm asked, I will repeat it. However, I don't think it's a politically smart strategy. It's a dead end. All it does is result in more and more and more devastation in Gaza. They have the right, but I don't think it's a smart strategy. But it's very hard to convince them otherwise. And secondly, again, to return to the point of the gentleman who asked the first question, you have to reach a broad public in the West. And the only way you're going to reach a broad public is if the public perceives such a demonstration as coming from below and not being directed or manipulated by Hamas. If they see it as basically a spontaneous, mass, nonviolent resistance from below, it has a chance of being capturing the support, the feelings, the sympathies of people in the West. If they perceive it as being a Hamas-led and organized demonstration, it will completely delegitimize it. But you can't get them to give up power. They want to control everything. I'm not here to demonize them. I don't like where they've gone, but I don't feel they were ever given a chance. They were like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who was never given a chance to lead. Hamas was never given a chance from the day after they won the elections in January 2006. All the screws were turned to destroy them. Same thing with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Having acknowledged that, I think it's also correct to say that it's in a very bad place now. It's just one more organization trying to maintain control and keep power, and they've gotten it into their heads that they and the revolution are one. No, they're not one. They are an organization, and that's the beginning and the end of it. There's the people, that's one. So I think there are possibilities in theory, but the likelihood is pretty small that anything is going to happen. But I don't think that's because of a lack of objective possibility. There are factors which are preventing it from happening, but I do think you have a very compelling case. If 2 million Gazans march to the checkpoint with just one slogan, very simple, one slogan, 3 words: enforce the law. That's it. We're not asking for more, we're not asking for less. Enforce the law. And then you present to the public, because we have our responsibility, it's a mutually designed civil disobedience. We have to say 95% of the drinking water in Gaza is not fit for human consumption. You have to tell the public here that each morning a parent has to face the reality that each cup of water, or anything which takes water, requires water, is poisoning their kids. That's all because of the blockade. That's the blockade. The lives of the people there have been systematically, methodically destroyed. The UN reports that have been coming out since 2012 keep saying in 2020, which is only 3 years from now, Gaza will be, this is the word the UN reports keep saying, it will be, I'm quoting them, it will be uninhabitable. Uninhabitable. You can't live there. Gaza will be extinct. If we say enforce the law and we depict these conditions, citing authoritative sources, and we show the people there willing to sacrifice, I think we have a chance. It's not going to be easy, because as everybody in this room knows, there's a big international agenda now. There's Syria, there's Iraq, there's Yemen, there's Libya. It's a very crowded plate. So it won't be easy to seize the attention of the public. I recognize that. But I also have to recognize another fact, which is an astonishing fact, I have to tell you. Denmark is a small place. As I understand, 6.7 million people. I'm kind of surprised I keep filling rooms. If I came here to speak on Kashmir, and then Kashmir is a very ugly place. I mean, the Indian government has killed hundreds of thousands of Kashmiris. It's a really wretched place. I would probably fill 4 seats. If I were to come here and speak on Tibet, maybe 6 seats. But look around you. During the break, I said to Masih, I said, that was not smart telling them to leave during the break, because I know from experience, once they leave, they never come back. I'm kind of surprised. You all came back. It means there's quite a impressive base of support. And if they were to mobilize there under a persuasive platform, a lot of you would be out there supporting them. There's the truth of the matter is, not even climate change can bring out audiences like this. So the cause still lives. The problem is its potential has not been exploited. If it were exploited, capitalized on, taken advantage of, I think there are very big possibilities. And this is a tremendous testament to that fact. Last night, 500 people in the Royal Library, and this event sold out in 2 or 3 hours. You can't name another cause that does that. So sometimes I feel like, and you'll forgive me if it sounds wrong, but I hope you'll understand the sentiment. Palestinians often say, nobody cares about us, everybody ignores us. Actually, it's not true at all. Compare that cause, Palestine, with Kashmir, Tibet, Sahara, and any number of other causes. There's just a much bigger reservoir of support for Palestine than any other cause. Not every other, but most. It's just not exploited. That's the problem. It's not capitalized on.
Should we take 2 questions, perhaps?
I think we wait for time.
Let's take 2, if that's okay.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ali from Libya. First of all, a small comment about the food. Next time when you come here, Professor, ask for falafel restaurant. So you'll get so much food and a very simple order, falafel. The questions are, maybe one of them you have answered already, but you have the right to ignore it if you think that you have answered. What's your future analysis or how do you see the perspective of the future, putting in consideration all what's happening in the world now? The other question, what's our individual responsibility here? Because we are, at least I could see that most of us, not me of course, but most of the guys are very young, so they might have responsibility towards the thing that we are talking about. The other thing, most Jews, normal Jewish people that I meet in Europe or when I travel, they don't have problem understanding me or understanding the Palestinian cause. And I don't think that because they are polite with me. No, I think because they were genuine. But is there any Jewish movement to do something about it or to be more, and it's not only for the future of Palestine, it's also for the future of the normal Jewish person to have a good chance to live with others. Thank you.
I think there are very reasonable prospects for reaching large numbers of Jews at this point in time, for a very simple reason. Jews, especially in places like the US and the UK, they tend to be liberal. 90% of Jews support Barack Obama in 2008, which was a higher percentage than even Puerto Ricans who support Barack Obama, Hispanics who support Barack Obama. They tend to be liberal on almost all issues. And part of being liberal is believing in the rule of law. That's part of the liberal mindset. Believing in peace and not war. And so you can, on the one hand, you can persuade Jews using the rule of law and human rights. You could persuade them that Israel is in a bad place now. It's doing things which are just unacceptable. And the other side of the coin is Israel is a kind of crazy place now. It's a lunatic state. And unfortunately, it's not simply limited to the state, but the population has gone over the edge. The reason that loudmouth, obnoxious, racist, Jewish supremacist Mr. Netanyahu keeps getting reelected is because when Israelis look at him, they see themselves. He's a reflection of who they are. And American Jews don't really connect to that. I would suspect that the number of mainstream American Jews, there's two constituencies in American Jewish society which are quite reactionary: Orthodox Jews and the Russian Jews. But leaving those apart, and that's about 15% maybe of American Jewry, the rest, I don't think 6 of them voted for Trump. I mean that. Leaving aside the Orthodox and the Russian Jews. So when they see that Trump, for whom they're repelled by him, and they see that Mr. Netanyahu is thrilled and euphoric to see his clone now occupying the White House, another loudmouth, obnoxious, racist, in his case, white supremacist, they're not comfortable with that. It's kind of an embarrassment. This is the Jewish state. They're embracing Donald Trump. There's something wrong there. So there's a serious disaffection among American Jews for where Israel has gone and where it continues to head in a kind of lunatic direction. And so there's real possibilities, I think, now of reaching American Jews, because Netanyahu and the face of Israel that he represents is antithetical. It's the opposite of what American Jews, their self-image. I suspect probably in the last election, I don't remember the statistics now, but it must have been at least 80% voted for Hillary Clinton, and probably even higher. So I think there is real possibilities, but we have to be clear about the possibilities. There are possibilities of reaching American Jews on international law, human rights, and so forth. But if you want to take it to, in any way, dissolving the state of Israel, you lose them. Don't waste your time. If you want to talk about eliminating Israel, dissolving Israel, whatever you want to call it, but basically you're talking about ending the state of Israel, you lose them. Now, you may say, I don't care, so I'll lose them. That's fine. But then be honest about it. Don't pretend that you're going to try to build a movement that includes large sectors of American Jews and at the same time talk about one state. It's not going to happen. There are limits. And Jews are not prepared, except for fringe elements, are not prepared for the idea of Israel's dissolution, disappearance. If you talk about you want to democratize Israel, you want equal rights for Palestinians in Israel, yes, you can win over Jews to that. But if you want to talk about dissolving, eliminating, destroying, whatever language you want to use, you're of course free to advocate that, but let's be realistic. You're not going to reach anyone except marginal elements in the American Jewish community. That's not a realistic prospect. I'm leaving aside the moral judgment. I'm just talking practical, political judgment. It's not realistic.
Thank you. First of all, we just started like in 1967, and because it's like 151, you mentioned 100 years and 50 years. I never heard about expiry dates for causes. I never heard about expiry dates for causes. It's like the cause started when the Zionism, which is the core of our problem, started. So we just tried, as you showed us, every kind of struggle. We tried fighting, peace negotiations. We put our kids in the front, by the way, if you remember Muhammad Durra, they shoot at them. So our leadership now is not just pragmatic, they're more security guards. And nothing gonna change unless the Zionism ideology changed. When the Nazis started, Europe accepted it if he didn't continue occupying. But the problem will be a problem. And Germany now is not eliminated, it's there, but it's not Nazist anymore. And Israel will not be eliminated, but it will be a real democratic country. So I think we came here to hear how can we solve our real problem? How can we defeat Zionism ideology for us, for the Israelis, for the world? Not just hearing about how can we embarrass Israel around the world. And we have, by the way, resolutions, UN resolution, more than Kuwait has petrol. Thank you, sir.
I feel an obligation, of course, if we're going to accomplish anything, to be honest. I don't think there's any usefulness or productiveness in talking about Zionism and wanting to eliminate Zionism. For 99% of the Danish population, for all Danes know, Zionism is a hairspray. Maybe it's a deodorant. Why use language that doesn't mean anything to anybody? Why not focus, pinpoint, identify? What is your grievance? What do you want to eliminate? What do you think is unfair? What do you think is criminal? Identify it, specify it, make it precise. And that has meaning for a public. I don't know. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Zionism, so I should have a real stake in wanting to keep it alive. I didn't get a job out of my dissertation, so at least I want my dissertation to live as an idea. But I'm perfectly willing to say I think we should just forget about it, because I don't think it identifies anything. The defense minister, Lieberman, calls himself a Zionist. Noam Chomsky calls himself a Zionist. If both of them are Zionists, then it doesn't really identify anything clear for the public. For me, Zionism is not the enemy. Injustice is the enemy. Lies are the enemy. Inhumanity is the enemy. Human suffering is the enemy. Zionism is Zionism is one tiny particle of the world's injustice and the many ideologies that compose that injustice. if Trump is expelling Mexicans, denying entry to immigrants, if he's rounding up kids in school now, is that the fault of Zionism? There are 10,000 injustices in the world, and the world itself is not a very big place, but even in this tiny place called planet Earth, there are 10,000 different injustices, and I'm not going to fixate and obsess over Zionism. I'm going to point to the injustice. Let's fight it. But let's not turn this thing into some cosmic force, Zionism. You know? If you want to talk about capitalism, yeah, I'm ready to go there. But even that I don't think is sufficiently precise. But I don't see the point of it. I can understand your anger, and I can understand your pain. I understand that, but I don't see the point of these soliloquies about Zionism. I don't see it. We have to break out of our little bubbles and try to reach a broad public. It's the only way we're going to win, because as the previous person said, or one of this gentleman said, we're not going to get any support from people above. You know, we have to reach people, and I think we can. I'm going to leave it to the organizers for the right of reply. If you want to give it to him, that's fine with me.
Would you like to reply?
Yeah, please.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. It's not pain, it's just I don't like to be in the focus.
According to you, sir, so ISIS is not a problem, it's the injustice. And Nazis wasn't the problem. So it's the injustice. I think that racism causes everything when the normal Israeli thinks that he's superior, so he can kill. It's the ideology that created everything, all terms of this, because he thinks that those people are not human like him. And I know that they think that we're not human as them. And according to Israeli reporters. Actually, I'm from Jerusalem, I just came from there, and if you want to talk about implemented, doable solution, two-state solutions, unfortunately, is unimplementable anymore, in Jerusalem especially. But to just ignore the ideology and talking about Trump in the United States, if Israelis just read off the idea of that they are better than everybody and superior than everybody, I think many things are going to be changed. So thank you.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thought you were going to answer that. I have, first of all, I'm glad that you're alive. That's crazy that you still get to walk around. But maybe you can help me clarify my question, because I think it's pretty like this. I want to know about, because right now we're looking at this from one angle, I think, and that is like how people who are oppressed get the tools and strategies for whatever to make everybody else listen. And the other thing I want to address is like, what about us? You know, as you mentioned, you can't get like all these people in one room when it comes to these other subjects. So I want to ask what nobody seems to be saying, that we might not, for example, the empathy question, right? I mean, for example, it's a pretty known thing that journalists here can't really portray the truth unless we identify with it. I have a journalist friend who's in Syria, and she says like all the time she has to pick up the guy or woman who looks the best or people in Denmark can identify with in order for us to swallow the truth, right? So that's one problem that nobody seems to be talking about, because it says something about us. And another thing I want to ask you, because you have this scientific view, is if you can talk about how to break a man. And I say a man because the same thing applies to a nation, and so on, so on, so on. And people don't seem to know how that takes place. And I'm pretty sure that people in power knows this. Maybe they have plans about it, but how to break a man and what that means, because I think that would be something people would understand.
How
to break a man. To break a man, you know, to break a nation, to break Palestine, for example. Like you say, this is the 50 years of millennium, or yeah.
The half century.
Kan I ikke få nogen til at oversætte det?
What?
Kan du ikke få nogen til at oversætte, eller? Hvad vil du sige?
How do you, are you asking about how you break?
No, yeah, I'm talking about a person, woman, child, whatever, like man, because now it's been 50 years, so like we have 50 years of history to reflect on this. How does that, what does it take to break a man, a nation, over a course of time, you know?
We're facing that situation right now. In Gaza, I guess the most recent poll showed that 40% of Gazans, if given the option, would leave tomorrow. Their spirits have been broken. And the West Bank, there's very little in the way of resistance anymore. There were very clever tactics that were used by the West in order to break any spirit of resistance, and a lot of them have succeeded. So the West came up with this very clever idea where anyone is talented in the West Bank, somebody who has skill, intelligence, a potential leader, you don't have to kill the potential leader. There's a very simple way. All you have to do is pluck him or her out of Hebron, out of Nablus, out of any of the cities, give him an NGO in Ramallah, set him up with him or her up with a computer, a terminal, a little office, give him or her something to do, pay him or her 4 times what any average Palestinian is going to earn, and you've neutralized them. You let them write all of these incendiary, provocative, revolutionary manifestos, but it's completely meaningless. And you empty out what was the backbone of the first Intifada, which were the mass organizations. Everyone in Palestine in 1987, they belonged to some political party. They belonged to some mass organization. And so when that accident happened in Jabalia, and it was just an accident, everybody got involved because their organizations got involved. There was a framework of resistance. There is no resistance anymore because the West came up with some clever ideas. There are many, but one of them was creating these NGOs. You know, Ramallah now is one of the most expensive cities in the world. I don't know how true it is, but a friend of mine who's very well traveled in the world, he said to me, Tel Aviv is like a little village next to Ramallah. Now, maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's a very expensive piece of real estate now because all of these NGOs, and I know a lot of people who work in those NGOs, and they're very smart. Very smart. And I think they found it very difficult to resist. And I can understand those temptations of having a normal life and going to cafes at night and meeting foreigners and attending conferences. It's very seductive, very difficult to resist those temptations. And as a result, half the population in Gaza wants to leave. And Mohammed is a very special person for me. He's been my eyes and ears in Gaza. But he knows, because he knows me, there was a sadness in me when he left, because I knew they were losing talent. More talent is going. And it's the same thing in the West Bank. The talent, either they leave or they end up in these NGOs, and there's nothing left. There's no resistance now. We have to be honest about that. They're just paper organizations. So when BDS says, we represent 180 Palestinian civil society organizations. No, you represent 180 people, each of whom claims to represent an organization. You don't represent 180 organizations. Let's be honest about that. If they represented organizations, there's a very simple test. Most people in this room remember about a year ago it was announced there's a third intifada. A third intifada. It was the random knifings that were going on. If there was a third intifada, and there are 180 or 200 or 26 trillion civil society organizations that support BDS, why weren't they leading this third intifada? There was no organization at all. It was hopeless, despondent, young people going out and randomly stabbing people because they're hopeless. Because there's no organization. And we have to be honest about that. You know, we have to be clear-headed. There was an African revolutionary, his name was Amilcar Cabral. He led a resistance in a little place in Africa called Guinea-Bissau. Turned into a complete mess, but that's a separate story. And he once gave a speech, and the speech was entitled, "Tell no lies, claim no easy victories." Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. And I think that's very wise advice. We shouldn't tell lies, and we shouldn't pretend that something exists when it doesn't exist, to claim easy victories. The situation is very bad now. Does that mean it's hopeless? No, I don't think so. I told you there are possibilities. They're not being exploited. But I have to tell you, speaking now as an American, 2 years ago, if you had asked me about the younger generation, the generation represented by this whole first row, people roughly in their 20s, I would have said, hopeless, hopeless, hopeless. They are addicted to the social media, and they are addicted to antidepressants. That was the whole generation. Every person I know between the ages of 25 and 35 in the United States, everyone, is on antidepressants and spends every waking hour on Facebook. They have to record their every movement and every thought on all their waking and also sleeping hours, you know. Even during sleep, you have to get up every 5 minutes to record what passed through your head. I saw a roach. Oh my God, OMG. You know? To which you get the response, LOL. A completely lunatic culture. They lost their minds, literally. But then along comes this phenomena This guy, Bernie Sanders, 75 years old, Jew, from Brooklyn. He grew up down the block from me, past his house every day. He went to my high school. He calls himself a socialist. Are you out of your freaking mind? This is America. And all of a sudden, the same group of people addicted to the social media, addicted to the antidepressants, this movement emerged out of nowhere. It's unbelievable. I went out. I was the senior citizen. You know, most of you won't understand it, but the older generation will. I was the Woodstock Brigade, you know. And they were so morally serious, so committed. It was really breathtaking. We went on long rides because we were going out of state to campaign in other states. I'm telling you, it was a big surprise to me, because I'm from the 60s, 70s generation. We were on the buses. In my generation, you went to an anti-war rally or you went to whatever protest, and in the bus on the way home at night, people passed around joints. I never took drugs. If I did, I'd tell you, but I didn't, so I'm just speaking factually. But everybody else did. I was always the exception to the rules. Okay? But on these trips we went on with Bernie's campaign, no drugs. None. Absolutely none. Nothing. The talk, the conversation. You figure young people, like the first row, you're going to have a lewd joke, a dirty joke, references to sex and body parts and whatever. No. Only politics. Analyzing, strategizing. You remember how they used to say, oh, Bernie's campaign, it's all men, Bernie's bros, they call them, Bernie's brothers. No, it wasn't. On the buses, 60% were women. Most of Bernie's really energetic supporters, they were women. Very strange, because Hillary was, you figure all the women are going to support for Hillary. Women, feminism, blah. No. They cared about the issues. They didn't care about what sex you were. They cared about the issues. It was breathtaking to watch, out of nowhere. And as I mentioned earlier, after the defeat that the Palestinians suffered in Lebanon in '82, everybody thought, including Professor Chomsky, who, as I said, his political eye is very shrewd, he thought it was over. And out of nowhere, 1987, the first Intifada emerged. Out of nowhere. Began with a traffic accident. And who would have thought? So we have to be careful about an excess of pessimism. But we also should be careful about not creating illusions. Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. And it's a very hard time there right now. Well, I just want to say, and I'll let you come to your, and I'll just say, I'm a little sad Mohammed left Gaza, and he knows that. I don't have to tell him. On the other hand, I don't want to see him suffer. It's a terrible situation there. And I know he has a lot of gifts, and I would hate to see them either wasted in the sense that he can't realize his potential, or that in the next Israeli attack, which some people are saying is pretty certain, I don't know, he gets killed. So I have to recognize he has the right to life, but it's still a loss for his people and his struggle. Good night.